I woke up from a coma and learned my wife hadn't waited to see if I'd live. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It came in pieces, the way your mind tests reality after being gone too long, afraid that if it takes in everything at once, it won't survive the weight of it. The first thing I felt was heaviness. Not pain, just an impossible weight pressing me into the hospital bed, like my body had forgotten how to be upright in the world. Machines hummed around me with quiet confidence, doing jobs my body hadn't been trusted to do on its own. Light filtered through blinds I didn't remember seeing before. Everything smelled clean and hollow. I tried to speak. Nothing came out. A nurse noticed my eyes were open and rushed over, her face brightening in a way that felt rehearsed. She said my name slowly, clearly, like she wasn't sure how much of me was still there. She asked if I knew where I was. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if that was true. Then I asked for my wife. The nurse hesitated. It was brief, barely a flicker. But when you wake up after weeks of unconsciousness, you notice things people think are invisible. Her eyes shifted away from mine for half a second before she smiled and said she'd let someone know I was awake. Someone. That word stuck with me. The doctor came in later and explained what had happened. The accident, the swelling, the coma. He said 6 weeks, like it was a manageable number, like it didn't represent nearly 2 months of my life erased. He told me I was lucky. He told me my recovery would be slow but promising. I asked again for my wife. "She's aware," he said carefully. "We'll reach out." She didn't come that day, or the next. On the third day, I started to understand something was wrong, not because she wasn't there, but because everyone else seemed to be acting around her absence. Nurses spoke gently, vaguely. A social worker introduced herself and talked about support systems, in a tone usually reserved for people who don't have one. When my wife finally arrived, she looked finished. That was the only word that fit. Not frantic, not exhausted. Composed, like someone who had already cried the worst tears weeks ago and had nothing left to spend. She hugged me carefully, like I was fragile, like I might disappear again if she held on too tightly. "I never left your side," she said quickly, too quickly. That was the first lie I heard with my eyes open. The second came when she said, "I didn't know if you'd wake up." She said it softly, like an explanation, like permission. Over the next few days, the truth seeped in through details no one meant to share. A nurse mentioning how devoted she'd been at first. A comment about how someone else had brought food for the staff. My phone, reset. Messages missing. Call logs wiped clean like someone had curated what parts of my life I was allowed to return to. And then, there was the name. I heard it twice before I asked who it belonged to. Once when a nurse thanked him for the pastries. Once when a clerk mentioned he'd already signed paperwork. Signed paperwork. I was still legally alive. Barely conscious, but alive. When I asked my wife who he was, she sat down hard in the chair beside my bed, like her body had been waiting for this moment to give up. "He works at the restaurant," she said. I didn't understand at first. "What restaurant?" I asked, my voice rough and unfamiliar. She swallowed. "The Italian place. The one we love. Our restaurant. The place we went every Friday. The place where the staff knew our names, knew my wine order, joked that we were the easy couple. The place where we celebrated anniversaries and promotions, and once joked that if anything ever happened to us, at least we'd eaten well." "He was kind," she continued, eyes fixed on the floor. "He checked on me. He asked about you. One night we talked longer than we should have, and it just happened." I asked how long. She didn't answer. I asked again, slower this time. "Most of the time you were asleep," she said. The room didn't spin. I didn't feel dizzy. I didn't cry. Something inside me simply shut down. She hadn't cheated after giving up hope. She hadn't cheated because she thought I was already gone. She cheated while I was still breathing. while machines kept my heart steady, while doctors debated whether I'd ever wake up, while my life hung in a balance she'd already decided wasn't worth waiting for, with a waiter who had served us dinner. The worst part wasn't imagining them together. It wasn't the humiliation or the anger or even the loss. It was realizing my absence hadn't been empty. It had been occupied. That while I was trapped inside my own body, unable to move or speak, my place in the world had been quietly filled by someone who knew my favorite table and my wife's drink order. Lying there, staring at the ceiling of a hospital room I never expected to wake up in, I understood something that would change the rest of my life. I hadn't just survived a coma. I'd woken up in the middle of a life that had already decided how easily I could be replaced. When you wake up from a coma, people assume the hardest part is learning how to move again. They're wrong. The hardest part is learning what kept moving without you. The days after my wife's confession blurred together in a way that felt cruelly familiar. Physical therapy sessions, doctors testing reflexes, nurses reminding me of my name, the date, the accident, like my identity needed to be rebuilt piece by piece. Everyone focused on my body recovering, while my mind was stuck on one immovable fact. She hadn't waited, understood. Below is a fully rewritten, expanded Act 5, carefully paced for voice acting and strictly within 8,400 or 9,000 characters. Tone remains restrained, emotionally controlled, and grounded. No melodrama, no profanity, no explicit content. Act 5. Resolution, 8,600 to 9,000 characters. The months after I left didn't feel dramatic. They felt deliberate. Every day was structured around rebuilding things I'd never thought about before. Strength, routine, identity. Physical therapy became my anchor. Twice a week at first, then 3 times, then on my own. My legs stopped shaking. My hands steadied. My body remembered how to belong to me again. Doctors called it progress. I called it reclamation. I stayed with my brother longer than anyone expected. Not because I was incapable of living alone, but because I didn't want to rush into a silence that still echoed with her decisions. His house was loud and imperfect and alive, kids running in and out, music playing too loud, conversations that didn't tiptoe around my fragility. No one treated me like a miracle. That mattered more than sympathy. My wife tried to reach me for weeks. At first it was guilt, long messages sent late at night, apologies wrapped in explanations, fear disguised as honesty. She wrote about loneliness, about the pressure of waiting, about how unbearable it felt to imagine a future without answers. She never wrote about waiting for me. Then came the practical phase, counseling, mediation, starting fresh. She talked about vows, about sickness and health, about how people break under pressure and deserve grace. Grace, she seemed to believe, was something I owed her for surviving. I didn't respond. Eventually, the messages changed tone again. Shorter, defensive, sharp around the edges. She accused me of abandoning her, of punishing her for being human, of rewriting the story so she became the villain. That's when I knew she was finally sitting with the consequences instead of running from them. And then, silence. The waiter disappeared from the story without ceremony. I never heard from him again. I never sought him out. He wasn't the center of this, no matter how easy it would have been to make him that. He was proximity, opportunity, convenience. The real betrayal wasn't that she found comfort. It was that she decided I was already gone. The divorce moved faster than I expected. No arguments, no courtroom drama, just signatures and dates and the strange sensation of watching a shared life reduce itself to paperwork. When it was finalized, I waited for grief to hit the way everyone said it would. It didn't. Grief needs uncertainty to survive. What I felt was clarity. I moved into a small apartment near a park. Nothing remarkable. Clean walls, large windows, quiet mornings. I furnished it slowly, intentionally. Every object chosen by me, for me, without explanation or compromise. No photos on the walls at first, no history, just space. The first night there, I sat on the floor with my back against the couch and listened to the city breathe outside my window, cars passing, distant voices, someone laughing somewhere below, life continuing, and for the first time since waking up, I felt present inside it. Weeks passed, then months. I stopped thinking about what I'd lost and started noticing what I no longer carried. The constant tension, the need to reassure, the quiet fear of being replaced without warning. I slept through the night. I ate without distraction. I moved through the world without scanning it for signs I'd missed. Distance didn't make the pain disappear. It gave it boundaries. Months later, I ran into her once. A grocery store aisle, fluorescent lights, ordinary shelves, no warning. She looked thinner, older somehow, like someone who'd spent too much time negotiating with regret instead of moving forward. When she saw me, her face softened into something hopeful before she caught herself. "I'm glad you're doing better," she said. "I am," I replied. She hesitated, then asked the question she'd clearly rehearsed. "Do you ever think if things had gone differently?" I studied her face, not with anger, not with longing, but with distance. The kind that comes from knowing you've already answered this question for yourself. "They did go differently," I said. "That's the point." She nodded slowly, tears forming, and I realized she was finally grieving, not me, but the version of herself who believed she could move on without consequence. I wished her well, and I meant it. Walking out of that store, I understood something I hadn't fully grasped before. The coma didn't end my marriage. It revealed it. It stripped away promises and hypotheticals and comforting narratives about what love should look like under pressure. It showed me exactly who would wait and who wouldn't. Some people survive by holding on. Others survive by letting go early. I survived by waking up. Not just from the coma, but from the belief that time together guarantees loyalty, that absence is automatically forgiven, that love doesn't require patience when things get hard. Now, when I sit in restaurants alone, I choose new places, new routines, new corners of the world that don't recognize me. I order slowly. I notice details. I stay present in my body, in my life. Because the truth is, I didn't lose everything while I was unconscious. I lost what was already gone, and what I woke up with, clarity, agency, strength, was more than enough. I survived the coma. I didn't survive my marriage, and understanding the difference between those two things is what finally set me free. She visited more often after that conversation, like honesty had earned her credit. She sat beside my bed, held my hand, talked about practical things, insurance forms, bills, how the house had been taken care of while I was gone. Gone. She loved that word. It made everything sound temporary, accidental. But nothing she described sounded accidental. She told me the waiter's name casually, as if repetition would make him less real. She said he'd been there for her when nights got long, when the restaurant closed late and she didn't want to go home to an empty bed. "I didn't plan for it to become anything," she said one afternoon, eyes glossy but steady. "I just needed someone to talk to." I stared at the ceiling while she spoke, watching the slow movement of light from the window. I didn't interrupt. I didn't ask questions. I was starting to understand that questions were dangerous, because every answer filled in a space that had once belonged to me. The nurses treated her differently now. I noticed that too. Less warmth, less assumption. One of them asked quietly if I wanted my emergency contact changed back to my name. Back. I nodded. Later that day, a social worker came by with paperwork. She explained it carefully, like she was navigating a minefield. Temporary authorizations, decisions that had been made while I was unconscious, documents signed on my behalf. I recognized the handwriting, not my wife's, his. The waiter had signed forms while I lay in a hospital bed, brain swollen, life uncertain. He had been trusted to make choices in a space that should have been sacred. When I asked my wife why, she didn't meet my eyes. "He was there," she said. "They needed someone. Someone. Not my parents. Not my siblings. Not the friends we'd built a life with. Someone who brought bread baskets and took drink orders." The physical recovery was slow, humiliating. My legs trembled when I stood. My hands shook when I tried to hold a cup. Each small failure reminded me how vulnerable I still was, how dependent. And that dependency changed everything. I couldn't storm out. I couldn't leave. I couldn't even sit up without help some days. My body had become a negotiation, and my wife knew it. I saw it in the way she spoke, careful, soothing, almost managerial. She talked about the future like she was already drafting a version that didn't require my input. "Once you're home, we'll figure things out," she said. "We've both been through a lot." Both. She framed the affair like shared trauma. I started noticing the gaps in her stories, times that didn't line up, evenings that stretched too long. She mentioned the restaurant often, how comforting it was, how familiar. Familiar. The word landed differently now. One afternoon, while she stepped out to take a call, a nurse leaned in close and lowered her voice. "I'm not supposed to say this," she said, "but he used to come by a lot. The other man." I turned my head slowly. "He brought flowers," she continued. "Food. He acted like family." Family. By the time my wife returned, smiling tightly, something inside me had hardened into clarity. This wasn't a moment of weakness. This was a role she'd stepped into while I was unable to object. That night, lying awake with machines humming beside me, I thought about the restaurant, our favorite table, the way the waiter used to greet us by name, the way my wife would smile when he poured her wine. I'd thought that smile was harmless. Now I understood something unsettling. He hadn't replaced me after the coma. He had been practicing before it. And the realization that followed was even worse. By the time I woke up, this wasn't an affair she was trying to end. It was a life she'd already learned how to live. And I was the complication. Lying there in the dark, muscles aching, heart steady, I made a quiet decision. I wasn't going to confront her yet. I wasn't going to ask her to choose, because I already knew the answer she'd give if I stayed weak long enough. Before I could decide what to do with my marriage, I needed to do something far more important. I needed to get strong enough to leave it. Recovery teaches you patience whether you want it or not. Every step forward came with limits: how long I could stand, how far I could walk, how much my head could handle before the room tilted. But as my body relearned strength, my mind did something else entirely. It started paying attention. I stopped listening to what my wife said and started noticing what she avoided. She never used his name anymore. She referred to him as "that time," or "what happened," as if language itself could reduce the damage. She also stopped talking about the restaurant altogether, like erasing the place might erase what had happened there. It didn't. One afternoon, a week before I was scheduled to be discharged, a physical therapist asked casually if my friend would still be handling rides once I was home. I looked at her. "What friend?" She hesitated, then glanced at the chart. "The gentleman who's been signing in. He brought you soup last week." Soup. I hadn't known about that. Later that day, when my wife went to get coffee, I asked the nurse for the visitor log. I said I wanted to remember who had come while I was unconscious, to thank them. That wasn't a lie. I just didn't expect the list to be that long. His name appeared again and again, sometimes daily, sometimes twice in one day, always after restaurant hours, always late. I stared at the dates, cross-referencing them with what my wife had told me about being too tired to visit or overwhelmed to come in. On nights she said she stayed home, he was here. On nights, she said she cried herself to sleep. He brought food and flowers and jokes. He didn't replace me emotionally, he replaced me logistically. I asked the nurse one more question. Did he ever stay late? She gave me a look that answered before her words did. He had a badge. A badge. That meant access. After hours access. Trust. When my wife came back, I asked her about it directly. Did he have a badge? I asked, keeping my voice neutral. Her shoulders stiffened. It was just easier, she said. He was helping. Helping. I realized then that she didn't see this as betrayal anymore. She saw it as adaptation, survival, something she'd justified so thoroughly while I was unconscious that the justifications had hardened into belief. That night, I lay awake thinking about how quietly a life can be reassigned, how someone else can step into your routines, your places, your rhythms, not with force, but with permission. My permission, given unintentionally through absence. The next discovery came from my phone. A technician brought it back, restored, cleaned up. Your wife organized everything, he said cheerfully. Organized. Entire threads were gone, photos missing, even location history disabled during the weeks I'd been unconscious. It wasn't sloppy, it was deliberate. But she'd missed one thing, a receipt, buried in an email folder she hadn't thought to delete. A charge from the restaurant, late night, multiple items, 2 glasses of wine, dated 3 weeks into my coma. The note attached was short. On us. Come by any time. I stared at it until the screen dimmed. They hadn't just met during my coma. They'd been welcomed. When I confronted her with that, something finally cracked. She sat down heavily, pressed her palms together, and said, I didn't think you'd ever see that. That sentence told me everything. She hadn't planned to confess. She'd planned to move forward. The affair hadn't been a reaction to loss. It had become a replacement strategy. And suddenly, the weeks of weakness made sense. Not just physical, but relational. Why she'd been careful. Why she'd spoken to me like someone already half gone. I wasn't her husband recovering. I was an obstacle returning. That night, alone with the steady beep of monitors, I stopped thinking about forgiveness, or reconciliation, or understanding. Instead, I thought about timing, about how people show you who they are when they believe the outcome is already decided. She'd decided while I was unconscious. Now it was my turn. I didn't need proof for an argument. I didn't need leverage. I needed distance, and the strength to claim it. The next morning, when the doctor said my discharge date could be moved up, I smiled for the first time since waking. Not because I was ready to go home, because I was ready to leave. Leaving the hospital should have felt like a victory. Instead, it felt like crossing a border I hadn't agreed to. My body was still weak. My steps were careful. Every movement reminded me how close I'd come to not making it back at all. My wife walked beside me, holding my arm like she was guiding something fragile, something she'd already learned how to live without. We didn't go home right away. She said the house wasn't ready yet. Too many memories, too much stress. She suggested we stay somewhere else for a few days. A short-term rental she'd already arranged. Already. That word followed me everywhere. The place was clean, quiet, and neutral. No photos, no history. Just a temporary space that matched exactly how she spoke about our future. Undecided, flexible, easily rearranged. The first night there, she slept deeply. I didn't. I lay awake listening to her breathing, steady and unbothered, and realized something that finally pushed me past hesitation. She wasn't relieved I survived. She was adjusting to the inconvenience of it. The next morning, while she showered, her phone lit up on the nightstand. A message preview appeared before I could look away. I miss you. When can I see you again? No name. Just a heart emoji. I didn't feel panic or rage. I felt clarity sharpen into something solid. When she came out of the bathroom, wrapped in a towel, I held the phone up. She stopped cold. "I thought you said it was over," I said calmly. She didn't deny it. She didn't rush to explain. She just closed her eyes like a tired child caught doing something she'd hoped would slide by unnoticed. "I didn't know how to stop," she whispered. That was the moment I stood up, slowly, carefully, deliberately, and realized I didn't need to raise my voice to end this. "You didn't want to stop," I said. "You wanted me not to wake up." She looked at me then, truly looked, and whatever argument she'd been preparing dissolved. "That's not fair," she said weakly. "It's accurate," I replied. She tried to cry, tried to tell me about fear, about loneliness, about how the hospital smelled like endings and how the restaurant felt alive, about how the waiter made her feel seen when she thought I was already gone. "You weren't gone," I said. "You just didn't want to wait." That sentence broke something. She sat down heavily and admitted what she hadn't said out loud before, that when the doctors told her my chances were uncertain, she'd started imagining a future without me. Not out of cruelty, but out of preparation. She'd let herself believe it was kinder to move forward than to stay frozen in fear. "And when you woke up?" I asked. She hesitated. "I panicked," she said, "because I'd already started another life." There it was. Not a mistake, not grief, a replacement. I picked up my jacket and keys. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice suddenly urgent. "Somewhere you can't edit me out," I said. She reached for my arm, then stopped herself, like she knew touch no longer worked. "This doesn't have to end like this," she said. "It already did," I replied. "You just finished it while I was unconscious." I left the apartment and took a taxi to my brother's house. The ride felt surreal. Streets I knew passing by, unchanged, while my life felt like it had been swapped out when no one was looking. When I arrived, my brother opened the door, took one look at me, and didn't ask questions. He just stepped aside and let me in. That night, for the first time since waking up, I slept without machines nearby and without her breathing in the dark. The next day, I made phone calls. A lawyer, the hospital, my employer. I changed my emergency contact. I revoked permissions. I reclaimed decisions that should never have been made without me. When my wife realized I wasn't coming back, her messages shifted tone. First apologetic, then defensive, then desperate. She talked about vows, about sickness and health, about how people make mistakes under pressure. I didn't respond, because what she'd done wasn't a reaction to pressure. It was a choice made while I couldn't object. The final confrontation came when she showed up at my brother's house unannounced. She stood on the porch, eyes red, holding the weight of consequences she'd assumed would never fully land. "I didn't think you'd leave like this," she said. "I didn't think you'd replace me while I was alive," I replied. She asked if there was any chance to fix it. I answered honestly. "No," I said, "because if I'd stayed unconscious longer, you'd already be gone." She didn't argue after that. She just nodded slowly, like someone finally understanding that some doors don't reopen once you walk through them. When she left, I felt something settle. Not peace yet, but certainty. The coma hadn't almost killed me. It had shown me exactly who was willing to live without me. And that knowledge, painful as it was, made the next step unavoidable. I wasn't going back to the life she'd rehearsed while I was asleep. I was going to build one she could never step into again.